Hello and welcome to another TLDR Explains video. In this one, we're going to be talking about something pretty topical. Does social media suppress conservative voices? With Trump recently banned from Twitter and fact-checking increasing across all services and platforms, there are increasing accusations that those on the right are being suppressed and silenced by Silicon Valley. In fact, it's become such a clear belief that some seem to just state it as fact.
And it seems to be if they're conservative, if they're Republican, there's discrimination and big discrimination.
We will not let large corporations silence conservative voices.
Google and Twitter and Facebook.
We're not going to let them control.
So we're going to try and give a more nuanced answer to this question, but also explain some of the deeper issues behind it. Before we get going, yesterday we launched our brand new channel, TLDR Global, where we'll be discussing all kinds of global news stories. In the first video we put out yesterday, we'll be discussing how COVID spread around the world, going from an exclusively China-related issue just over a year ago to a major global catastrophe today, a catastrophe being led by the United States. You can find that video and subscribe to the channel for future updates by clicking the link in the description. So let's get straight to it. Does social media unfairly censor conservative opinions? Well, the answer is sort of. For analysis's sake, we're going to split censorship into two forms of censorship. Passive censorship, which is almost unintentional censorship, a good example of this would be algorithmic biases, and active censorship, which is more intentional, targeted, and explicitly political. A caricatured example would be if Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter, decided that he really didn't like the UK's Liberal Democrat Party and kicked their leader, Sir Ed Davey, off Twitter. This would be active censorship, as it's entirely deliberate, and it's got an explicitly political slant. The equivalent case of passive censorship would be that if Google rewrote their algorithm so it didn't show results that less than 100 people a week looked for. Then let's say 90 people look for Ed Davey a week, and Ed Davey goes to search his own name, and it goes, "Did you mean Dead Avey?" and shows him results for Dead Avey, which 101 people searched for last week. In this case, Ed Davey would be censored in some sense, sort of kicked off Google, but this was untargeted and accidental, and would be more of a passive form of censorship. Ed, you can thank us for the only bit of coverage you're going to be getting this week. Jokes, we like the Lib Dems really. But as you'll see in a second, there's not a clear dividing line between the two, and in some cases, censorship falls somewhere in the middle. So it's probably best to be conceptualized as more of a spectrum, with active censorship on one extreme and passive censorship on the other. So on this spectrum, Twitter would be on the active end because it does the most individual bans. Google would be on the most passive side because it's all about algorithms and banning someone's Google account really isn't that deep. And Facebook would fall somewhere in the middle because it does some individual account banning, but most of the controversy about censorship on Facebook is regarding their adverts and algorithms. So, back to the question, are conservatives being censored on social media? Well, in terms of passive censorship, the answer seems to be no. Some conservatives claim that algorithms artificially suppress conservative results, but there's just simply no good evidence for this, or at least our research couldn't find any. Trump actually complained in 2018 that Google's algorithm was biased against him, citing a stat from a conservative blog called PJ Media that 96% of Google results about Trump were from liberal media outlets. However, this 96% figure just comes from the fact that someone at PJ Media literally Googled Trump one day and found that of the top 100 results, 96 were from left-leaning sites, which isn't the most scientific approach. It's also worth noting that the author used a pretty wide definition of left-leaning, which included sites like BBC News, Reuters, and Business Insider, with them even admitting that this wasn't scientific. There are also relatively innocent reasons why this might have happened. For example, it might be that left-leaning people read more Trump articles than right-leaning people. Or it might just be that on that day, Trump did something that left-leaning outlets were particularly keen to report on. Beyond just this, Google's responses vary wildly depending on the user's history, so the results would vary from person to person and day to day. Anyway, The Economist did a proper analysis about this and found that once they controlled for trustworthiness and the volume of Trump articles that each site published, there was, quote, no evidence that ideology influences Google News results. Trump's grumbling aside, Media Matters for America have done 2 studies into this, using Facebook groups, and they found that if anything, conservative pages do better than left-leaning ones. Regardless, left and right-wing outlets get very similar levels of engagement as percentage of views, and conservative pages generally have larger net engagement. In fact, according to data from CrowdTangle, a public insight tool owned by Facebook, most of the popular political posts on Facebook are actually from right-wing commentators. Obviously, you wouldn't expect this if Facebook's algorithm was suppressing conservatives. Similarly, Politico did an analysis of more than 2 million social media posts from across Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and the message boards Reddit and 4chan, and they found that conservatives actually seem to have an algorithmic advantage. Before we move on to the other side, active censorship, it's worth noting that while studies didn't find any evidence of anti-conservative bias, they did still find a bias, and that was towards partisanship in general. Basically, as you might have noticed from both of the graphs we showed you earlier, and from your everyday online life, non-partisan pages reliably get less traffic than explicitly partisan ones. We don't want to get too far off topic here, because we promised you a video about whether social media has an anti-conservative bias, and to be honest, this is a whole video in itself, but it's obviously very worrying. Algorithms and hosting sites push explicitly partisan material simply because it gets the most clicks, and that just means that everyone ends up seeing aggressively partisan content. In a sense, this has always been true. In the UK, for example, the Daily Mail has always been anti-Labour and the Mirror anti-conservative, and this attitude has helped them sell papers. But social media has only supercharged media partisanship. On a more trivial note, this is obviously bad for us too, because we try our best to be non-partisan, which is apparently a terrible business model. On that note, maybe we do love Ed Davey after all. Anyway, if conservatives aren't being passively suppressed by the algorithms, and are possibly even highlighted by them, are they being unfairly censored by active censorship? Well, the answer here is probably yes, to be fair. Most of the debate revolves around Twitter, because it does the most individual account banning. Wikipedia even has a whole list of Twitter suspensions and bans, which we'll link to down below, and the majority are from right-leaning commentators. There are some exceptions. For example, Twitter has banned some Antifa accounts and some Occupy movement activists. But for the most part, it's right-leaning commentators. Obviously, everyone's talking about Trump's ban at the moment, but Trump is a single data point with some pretty unique context, so it's hard to infer anything about general anti-conservative censorship on that front. Now, this list of banned users isn't definitive proof, and if anyone can provide a plausible explanation for why this might be, then feel free to discuss it in the comments. One possible explanation is that Twitter users are just more left-leaning in the first place, perhaps because young people use the internet more and they're more likely to be left-leaning. The data bears this out too. A Pew study found that 70% of highly prolific US adult tweeters were Democrats. Left-leaning users are more likely to report right-leaning users, and Twitter is more likely to ban someone if they've been reported multiple times. So perhaps more Democrats reporting high-profile Republicans could play into this disparity. It could also come down to the fact that the platforms have terms of service, which politicians like Trump undeniably broke. Potentially, these rules are less accepting of current populist right-wing narratives, which are popular in the US and around the world. Maybe that's a problem, and free speech should always be defended above anything else. Or perhaps some things, such as hate speech and the incitement of violence, should never be protected, regardless of which side of the aisle it comes from. And perhaps those on the right are currently more likely to break these kinds of rules, leading to their suspension. Anyway, there might be a relatively innocent explanation, but it's hard to dispute that the majority of individual account bans on Twitter are right-leaning commentators. Which leads us to a bigger question. Should companies like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube even have the power to censor people? In the US, people are very quick to proclaim their First Amendment rights. Just look at the whole conversation surrounding Trump's suspension. But ultimately, that's a completely separate issue. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution may grant the right to free speech, but it relates solely to the US government, preventing the government from limiting free speech of individuals. The First Amendment simply doesn't come into play for cases like this, where private companies are absolutely able to grant access to their platform to whoever they want. And even within the First Amendment, there are exceptions to free speech, which means that some categories of speech are granted less or no protection at all, including some of the things that Trump's been accused of doing on Twitter. We don't have time for this debate today, but if you want us to tackle this issue in the future, should private companies have the power to remove people from their platforms, then let us know in the comments. In conclusion then, it seems that there's no evidence of conservatives being suppressed in a passive way. In fact, their social media presence seems to be promoted and surfaced more regularly. Active censorship does seem to be more prevalent, but it's still difficult to prove that this is as a result of ideological bias, rather than genuine rule breaking on the part of those getting banned. What do you think though? Are people being suppressed because of their ideologies? Do platforms have the right to mediate and censor those using their products? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we post. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.